Bard's Tale. The last tale was of Odin's long and ruthless quest for knowledge, but you may have wondered what the other Aesir were doing at the time. The likes of Tyr, Frigg, Freya, or Balder. What were they doing while Odin hastened to stave off the coming of Ragnarok? But this was Odin's charge, his primary directive. The other Aesir each had their own focuses, which lorded over their actions. Tyr was a god of war, Frigg a goddess of destiny, Freya the goddess of love, and many more besides. The Aesir covered many, if not all, aspects of living beings, and these were attested to by their actions. The embodiments of ideal archetypes, humans sought to embody the deity which best represented their most precious aspects. Lover, writer, poet, farmer, ruler, and warrior. And no greater archetype of the loyal and honorable warrior could be found in the Norse pantheon than the ever-vigilant and unshakable god of thunder and lightning, Thor. Thunder was the embodiment of him, and the lightning was his hammer as it swung to slay giants, while he rode across the sky in his chariot, drawn by the two goats, Tenglisnir and Tangin-Yosta. He was the defender of Asgard, and his protection extended to all those of honor, courage, and duty. With his mighty hammer Mjolnir, forged by the dwarves of Nidavellir, his magical belt Mjolnir, which doubles his already formidable strength, and the iron gauntlets Jungleipa, needed to wield Mjolnir, he is the bane of Jotuns, who fear him above all other Aesir. And for good reason, as several stories tell about Thor and his overwhelming victory against the Jotuns. But not all. Thor may be one of the most powerful Aesir, but there are certainly others out there in the Nine Realms which could challenge the mighty Thor and defeat him. Before we hear the tales of Thor, first we must know where he came from. Despite his apparent disdain for the giants, he is in fact 3/4 giant himself. Odin was the son of Bor and the giantess Bestla, and Odin had the child Thor with the giantess Hjord, also called Fjorgyn or Hlodin, goddess of earth. The interbreeding of gods and giants was quite common, but this fact never halted Thor in his duty to defend Asgard or others who needed aid against the Jotuns. Thor was the eldest of many children. His brothers were Balder, Vithar, and Vali, among many others. Thor himself has 3 children, one to the fertility goddess Sif, a daughter named Thrud, and 2 sons named Magni and Modi, to the giantess Jonsaksa. Thor and Sif live in Asgard, at a place known as Thrudvangar, meaning place of might. His palace Bilskirnir is the largest home in Asgard, having 540 doors, much like Valhalla. From his home, when he is to travel from Asgard on some adventure, he dons his gauntlets Jungleipa and his belt Mjolnir, lifts Mjolnir, and rides off on his goat-drawn chariot. Should Thor ever hunger, he will slay the 2 goats Tenglisnir and Tangin-Yosta and eat their meat. You may think this would hamper Thor greatly, but all he need do is place his hammer Mjolnir on each goat, and they are resurrected as well as before. Well, all but once. This tale follows Thor and the often treacherous trickster god known as Loki, as they travel to the fortress city of Utgard in Jotunheim. While on their journey, they were given lodging by a poor farmer named Egil and his son Thialfi and his daughter Roskva. As a sign of gratitude, Thor slew his 2 goats and skinned them, preparing them as a dinner for the family. Once the supper was finished, Thor took the goats' bones and threw them onto the skins which he had laid on the floor. He told the family not to touch the bones. But while they all slept, Thialfi became so hungry he took the thigh bone from a skin, split it in 2, and sucked the marrow from it. When morning came, Thor awoke and cast the spell of resurrection with Mjolnir. Tenglisnir and Tangin-Yosta's bodies reformed, and they bleated joyfully. However, Thor noticed one of the goats had a lame leg, walking with a limp. Terrified of the god's wrath, Egil offered his children as servants for their arrogance. Thor accepted this payment, and took them on his journey to Utgard. They travelled across flat plains and rocky crags until the sun began to sink below the horizon. By this time, they had reached a massive forest, its trees taller than any on Midgard. Before it became too dark to see, they found a deserted building a little ways into the forest. Thor, Loki, Thialfi, and Roskva settled and slept. Though not for long, as the moon was high in the sky, an earthquake shook the whole building. Rumbling and groaning echoed around them. They stayed inside till dawn. Then Thor went outside, only to find a sleeping giant not far from the building. The rumbling and groaning they had heard was the giant's snoring. It was deafening. Thor considered reaching for Mjolnir, but too late, for the giant awoke and stood. Then even Thor became afraid, for the giant stood taller than any he had seen before. The giant called himself Sklimir, and despite his overwhelming presence, appeared to be friendly. A thought struck Thor, and he spun around to look at the building they had slept in, only to realize they had spent the night in the giant glove of Sklimir. The giant recognized Thor as the thunder god, and stated that he wished to travel with this small group. Thor would have argued against this if the giant before him didn't stand as tall as the trees. As it was, Thor had no choice but to agree. They travelled through the forest for the day, and stopped once it became too dark to see. Skrimir fell asleep, and did so quickly. But the others could not sleep, for Skrymir's snoring seemed to shake the very earth beneath them. In anger, Thor grabbed Mjolnir by the hilt, and brought the mighty hammer down on the giant's skull. Skrimir woke slightly, and asked if some leaf had fallen onto his head. Skrimir fell asleep again just as quickly as before, and his snoring kept the companions up until midnight. Immensely irritated, Thor lifted Mjolnir again, and struck Skrimir with his hammer, this time dead center in the crown of his head. Skrimir stirred, and asked Thor if an acorn or some such had landed on his head. Thor fearfully told him he had only just woken up, and the giant should try to get some sleep. Skrimir once again fell asleep, and Thor became determined to ensure that the next time he struck the giant, he would not wake up again. The sun was now beginning to rise, and the companions were terribly tired, having had no sleep due to the earth-rumbling snores of the giant. Thor was now more irritated than he may have ever been, and once again struck the giant across the skull with a powerful blow. Sklimir awoke, sat up, and asked if a stick had fallen onto his face while he slept. Thor abandoned any remaining hope he had of defeating this giant of giants. Sklimir decided they should go their separate ways, but gave the group directions to Utgard. Thor was relieved, and would be happy to never again cross paths with such a terrifying giant as Sklimir. With these directions, Thor and his companions arrived at Utgard, darkly foreboding and so tall its top could barely be seen through the thick layer of clouds above. This fortress was ruled by Utgarda Loki, king of the giants. Upon entering the fortress, they stood before the king's throne, and Utgarda Loki would allow them to stay if they were of any special skill. Loki took a step forward, and proudly announced that he could out-eat any giant. Loki was presented with a large portion of meat, and admirably ate every last piece from the bone. But his rival, Logi, was ruthless, and ate not only the meat, but the bone and the trencher it came in. Obviously, Loki lost. Next stepped forward Thialfi, who challenged a giant to a foot race, but, of course, lost 3 times to a giant named Hugi, each time doing worse than before. Finally, Thor took a step forward and challenged them to a drinking contest. Utgarda Loki had a servant fetch a long drinking horn. He proclaimed that any who could empty the horn in a single draught would be considered a great drinker, and a good drinker in 2. Thor, apparently, was neither of these things, for he could not finish it in 2 or even 3 swigs. Thor was becoming woozy and proposed he fight someone instead. Utgarda Loki challenged the drunken thunder god to lift a large cat. Thor scoffed. but found he could not lift the large cat. He pulled and tugged and hoisted, but only ever managed to lift one of the cat's legs. Thor became angry and insisted on fighting someone. The king called for someone called Eli, and in a moment an old crone stood before Thor. Try as he might, Thor could not even move the woman, but she was able to pull him off balance. Thor was painfully embarrassed, and was about ready to bash the giant king, when the king offered the angry god and his companions a place to stay. When the sun finally rose above the mountains and clouds of Jotunheim, Thor, Loki, Röskva, and Thialfi ate breakfast in silence. Once finished, Utgarda Loki invited them outside. They stood outside of Utgard, and here the king revealed the truth of the last few days. Utgarda Loki was Skrimir, and Skrimir was an illusion. Had Thor struck anywhere else, he might have actually killed him. The contestants they all faced in yesterday's challenges were all illusions too. Loki had not lost an eating contest to a giant named Hogi, but a wildfire. Thialfi did not lose a foot race 3 times to a giant named Hugi, but to Utgarda Loki's thought. And Thor may indeed be a great drinker, for while one end reached Thor's mouth, the other reached the sea. And while he had drunk, the level of the sea had actually dropped considerably. As for the cat, it was in reality the tail of Hjormungand, the Midgard serpent, which encompasses the Middle Earth. And finally, the old crone Eli was not an old crone at all, but old age itself. Utgarda Loki was amazed at what Thor had achieved, and told Thor to leave Jotunheim. Utgarda Loki claimed he would protect his domain again with deception and illusion should the terrible Thunder God ever return here. Thor wore a thunderous expression, and was terribly outraged. He would have killed Utgarda Loki had not the king vanished into the air. Thor spun about in anger, and prepared to storm the fortress Utgard, but it too vanished. Despite his rage, Thor had no other choice but to return to Asgard. Thor stands vigilant in Asgard, determined to see that no harm befalls his beloved home. So imagine his surprise when one day his father Odin rides into Asgard atop his steed, with a giant on a mount riding just behind. The giant was welcomed kindly by the Aesir, with Freya serving him ale from the horn which Thor usually drank from. Odin explained to Thor that when he was out exploring the realms, he met this giant named Hrungnir at Grjotunagada, where he challenged the giant to a race to see who had the better steed, his Sleipnir or the giant's Gulfaxi. As Hrungnir drank, he became boastful and aggressive. He shouted loudly that he would move Valhalla to Jotunheim, destroy the Aesir, and take Freya and Sif as his concubines. Fuming, Thor quickly interjected with a challenge. "Fight me." Hrungnir agreed, but only if Thor met him on Grjotunagada, where they could battle with weapons. It did not take long for the giant and the god to meet in the fields which bordered the land of giants. However, not in the way Thor expected. The giants of Grjotunagada did not like the idea of Hrungnir being defeated by Thor and to bring shame to their people, so they created a being of clay they called Mökkurkaufi. This giant of clay stood 9 leagues tall and 3 leagues wide, and within its chest beat the heart of a large mare. Hrungnir, with a stone heart, stone head, and stone shield, carried a large whetstone as his weapon, and stood beside the giant of clay. Hrungnir looked at Mökkurkaufi, and saw the clay giant was trembling slightly. Hrungnir looked across the field to see Thor wearing a dark expression, a storm of rage in his eyes, and understood the clay giant trembled with fear. Beside Thor stood his small servant boy Thialfi, who ran ahead to give Hrungnir a deceitful hint. Thor would strike from beneath the earth. The giant believed the small boy, and defended himself from the supposed attack by placing the whetstone beneath his feet. Once Thialfi was out of the way, Thor charged across the field, spinning Mjolnir about by its handle, then letting it fly at Hrungnir, At the same time, Hrungnir lifted his whetstone and hurled it at Thor. It collided with Mjolnir in midair and shattered in two, one piece falling far across the field, and the other lodged itself deep into Thor's skull. At the impact of the whetstone, Thor fell to the ground. As he did, Mjolnir struck Hrungnir, shattering his stone head. He fell across Thor, dead. His legs broke from his body and pinned Thor to the ground. In the fear and confusion of what had happened, Thialfi managed to dispatch of the clay giant Mokokalfi. Thor struggled to remove Hrungnir's stone legs from his throat. Thialfi ran over to him and tried to lift the legs himself, but to no avail. They were heavy as lead. In fact, none of the Aesir were able to help Thor, till Magni, his son 3 years of age, pulled the legs of his father. Thor was astounded and grateful, and gave his son Hrungnir's horse Galfaxi as a gift. Thor returned to his home, Thrudvangar, and attempted to have the whetstone removed from his head by the sorceress Groa, wife of Orvandil the Bold. Thor had a tale to tell of Orvandil, which he told to Groa as she cast a spell to dislodge the whetstone buried deep in his skull. Orvandil had been riding in a basket Thor carried sometimes, and he was carrying the basket with Orvandil inside when he crossed one of the rivers Alvagar, near the land of giants. The river flowed from Niflheim, and so it was very cold. So cold, in fact, that as Orvandil was lazily dangling one of his feet out of the basket, he accidentally dipped his toe in the water, and it froze. Noticing the frozen toe when Orvandil let out a shocked gasp, Thor broke it off and threw it into the sky. It is still there today, and is known as Orvandil's toe. Thor was very happy with his tale, but Groa was not. Thor's tale had distracted her from her spell with his ridiculous tale, so the spell hadn't worked, and Thor would remain with a whetstone lodged in his head a while longer. Thor is a character of many tales, and to encapsulate them all at once would be quite an undertaking, so this particular tale shall be split in two. In the next tale, you will learn of Thor's first true encounter with the world serpent Hjormungand, the beast fated to be slain by him, and to slay him in turn. And you will hear more of the trickster god Loki, who will have his own tales heard very soon.